Okay, so it's really fantastic. Amelia Womack, who's deputy leader of the party, has been able to come up and meet us in Harrogate here, Harrogate, Starbeck, Knaresborough. And we were just talking about the importance of voting for what you actually believe in. We've been discussing that with a few people this morning. So,
yeah,
what do you reckon?
I think it's clear that there's no such thing as a safe seat, really. There's only such thing as a safe voter. And more people are starting to question, are they a safe voter? Because people are realising that if you put a cross next to a party that you don't agree with, you're validating actions that you don't agree with. And that the only wasted vote is a vote that you don't believe in. That I think people are realising that you're never going to get the government you want unless you try and vote it in. And obviously we admit that the electoral system does benefit Conservative and Labour, and it does make things harder for us, but the only way we can tackle that is by making sure that we have votes that represent society and have votes that represent people. So we'll fight for electoral reform, but the only way we can make gains is by making sure people who believe in us vote for us.
Yeah, and I think another thing we've got to deal with is the fact that voters have got used to this crazy system that we're in this country. And many people we've met have not actually registered to vote, unfortunately. But I think people are realising that it's really important to do that and then to vote for what they believe in, because otherwise we're just never going to get change. It's a trap if we don't vote, use our vote.
Yeah, a little bit, but it's like got a little bit of a so, yeah.
Do you think when we come round to an election, it's all too sort of manipulated so that it all happens so quickly? It sort of comes up and we vote and then we forget about it for 4 years. And perhaps with PR we'd actually have more of a rolling road of political involvement from society. I don't know. I'd like to think so.
I think that it's true that the elections come round and suddenly you almost have this kind of car salesman mentality of everyone trying to get your vote and sell you their policies, when quite often the other parties in Parliament have actually just been doing the complete opposite of what those values or policies are. And I think I think that is a problem, and we do need to be making sure that people are feeling more empowered about politics as well. And that they feel like, I always find it interesting when you have people who have campaigned in a local area and that they've got petitions that have more signatures than the councillors who are elected to represent them. So there's more, those petitions are more valid than actually those councillors in office. And yet this kind of democracy isn't being looked at, isn't being used as a form of representation. And I wish that was allowed a voice, and I wish the politicians would recognise petitioning and demonstrations as a form of active politics, instead of just taking note of whether people vote for them or not.
Yes, and another factor is schools, the education system. There's no doubt that students in education need to be given the opportunity to discuss what sort of a life do we want to live, what kind of values do we want to live by. Children really care about those things, and yet the curriculum, and I've done some work on this, some academic work on this, the curriculum doesn't leave space for that kind of discussion and debate that children really want, and that would lead into real political analysis and interest and engagement and voting. So we really have to start at a young age and take it seriously that young people really do care.
I think that's because our investment in things like youth councils I find really important, and even things like some young people saying that they wish at school they'd had an opportunity to have a kind of fake election. I know that some schools do this, but not all schools, because even that act of going up and having your name crossed off a list and knowing what to do at the booth is a whole new experience. And if you've had a chance to do that at school, it means it will be less intimidating to actually go and do it in real life. And there's such simple things. School's meant to set you up for the skills that you need in life, yet politics seems to have been largely forgotten in our education.
Yes, yes. And I think we've been to most of the schools in Harrogate and Boroughbridge and Knaresborough now with this election, and it's been fantastic, the interest that the young people have shown. And some of them are holding mock elections, and they've been in touch with me to get information about the Green Party and so on. So it's great to see that happening. We should just encourage that as a central part of the curriculum, as with a lot of other areas of life, like how to look after a house, how to look after children, how to cook, how to, live your life really, and a lot of that gets pushed out with this sort of focus on an academic curriculum that everybody has to go through. Everyone isn't the same, and we need to give more importance to the uniqueness of all individuals.
Making sure, because it feels like schools have just become a factory churning out exam results, and a lot of the teachers who are dropping out now are dropping out because they feel that they're not supporting young people or children with learning. They're just trying to meet targets and getting a certain amount of exam results, and not having that role as a point of inspiration and finding out where a child's talents and skills or interests actually lie. And I think it's really important that we're trying to get rid of stats exams that mean that children are tested all through their lives, and actually bringing back that institution of learning into our education so that people can find out it's not just maths, English and science that people have talent in. People have talents in arts and in all kinds of different areas, and making sure that they have the opportunities to discover that.
Yes, and here in Harrogate it's very much a business-focused community, and business, well, it can grow out of all kinds of things, and as Amelia was saying, the arts is so important, the creative talents of people are so many and varied. We should be encouraging all of that and not just think it's the STEM subjects as some people think. It's allowing, sort of leading out the natural talents of every person, every young person, will lead to a much more dynamic community, business, life in general. So that's what we Greens want to promote.
Actually, I find all these cuts to the arts frustrating, because I think even Churchill said during the war, when people said, "Are you going to make cuts to the arts for the war effort?" And he said, well, if we make cuts to the arts, what are we fighting for? And I think it's so true in this time of austerity, especially if we have cuts to the arts, and actually what are we building our society for?
Yes, exactly.
Talking of society, recently there's been a bit of a smear campaign suggesting that the Green Party are anti-Semitic, which I must admit I kind of sat there and mused over it for a few minutes before I even started to try and find where this was coming from, and it all seemed to stem from a blog from a young lad who I assume is Jewish, and who'd found two really obscure little bits of information. Next thing you know, it's all over the internet. Are people getting confused between, shall we say, religious belief and political power in particularly, I suppose we've got to discuss Israel here, and the way that the mistreatment of the Palestinians and the way that the rest of the world is kind of turning a blind eye? Is that what, because someone dared to talk about it in the Green Party, is that what maybe has come over as seemingly anti-Semitic?
I think that's pretty much it. In our manifesto, we make clear commitments to support Jewish communities, acknowledging that Jewish communities have been targeted in things like hate crime, and that we need to be making sure that we're given that people support in these areas. But what we're clear about is that we're a humanitarian party, and that we will always fight for what we believe is right for humanity. And what's happened in Palestine is you've seen the number of deaths, you've seen the children lined up, and we don't believe that kind of, we don't believe that so many people should be killed in the name of any state. And I think we're clear that we want to make sure that we stop providing arms to Israel, but actually we don't want to provide arms to all kinds of different countries, and Israel is just one of them. And by making sure that we have humanity at the heart of our policies, then we do want to make sure that we protect Palestine and the Palestinian people, but not by hurting anybody in the Jewish community.
Yeah, it becomes becomes too easy to separate and to demonise certain groups, and that we want to stop that by education, by proper discussion all the time. Every discussion at the moment is distorted all the time by kind of dividing and ruling, really, and that's what we as Greens want to challenge, and much of that is through education and much better debate publicly. And that comes down to things like who owns the press, who influences the media, and we have strong policies on all of those things.
Going back to armaments, are we wasting money hand over fist on building an armed force which we could never use in a real situation?
Reference to Trident.
Kind of. I mean, I've been made aware recently that sort of leaked source, dare I say, we're actually building submarines, like going out of fashion, and I assume these are all nuclear. And yes, they're really probably the way forward in terms of being able to attack a country, but what use would they be, defending the real people of the UK, for that matter? I mean, if someone's running down the street with the intention of shooting several people with a machine gun, what use is it a submarine? And in that sense, are we looking at a new arena where it's basically submarines under the sea, and if they can't reach them, we're looking at drones? These are areas where UK industry is quite unsurpassed, I believe. Not in the drones, but certainly in the submarines. And I just wonder, when we're planning to spend, is it 40 billion on Trident over the next
100 billion.
It's just a bonkers amount of money. I can't even remember. But,
and especially during a time where, when I talk to people, that people's concerns are education, making sure that we have a public NHS, that they've seen cuts to our public services that have meant that so many people are falling through the cracks. And it's clear that people want investment in our public services and not see £100 billion go to a weapon that would be it's actually against the law to use, but an immoral to use. But I don't quote Michael Portillo that often, I have this one quote, but Michael Portillo was a former defence secretary, and even he says that Trident is past its sell-by date. Trident was made for the Cold War, and the wars of the future won't look like the wars of the past. I've heard some politicians say we need Trident to combat ISIS, but ISIS actually is a small group of people that you can't justify the civilian lives that would be lost as a result of using that nuclear weapon, and it definitely wouldn't be a deterrent to a group like ISIS, who, there aren't many things that would deter ISIS. There's more complicated issues at stake there, and I think most people are in agreement that Trident isn't the kind of weapon that will attack that kind of terrorism. And it means that these weapons are not fit for purpose in the modern world.
Yeah, I think we've got to look at our whole value system at the moment, because it's taking us over the edge, this whole materialistic system which kind of values people on what they earn rather than who they are and what they can contribute in their uniqueness. And business has a fantastic role to play if it only chose to. It could be a huge muscle for change, to move us in the right direction instead of the wrong direction, because at the moment we've got massive corporations who are amoral, pushing us in the wrong direction. I've been talking to some of the chambers of trade in Yorkshire recently about this, and it's interesting how people seem to assume that you have to have, just business has to do any old thing, rather than taking on this idea that if it was purposeful, if it chose to go in a certain direction, i.e. a sustainable direction, it could move us all in that direction, and it's so exciting, that possibility.
And I think that when you look at how economics works, there's a whole idea of externalities, and basically what that means are things that aren't accounted for in normal accounting procedures for business. So, for example, you're not accounting for a farmer doesn't put a value on his bees on his land, despite the fact that his business does not exist without bees, and those that meet the loss of bees will cost the farmer money. And I think that we're seeing a lot of the social externalities, the fact that Topshop makes so much money, yet we're forcing slave labour, well, we're forcing this unfair paid labour in other countries. We're buying Coca-Cola, we're forcing environmental damage and social damage onto other countries, and we just often see the brand without seeing stories, the human stories, or the environmental stories of quite often of despair that are actually behind that label.
And it just needs regulation. Instead of just allowing this free market model, this neoliberal thinking which says you just let the corporations do whatever they want and there'll be some sort of trickle-down effect to everybody else, which is clear now it's not happening. We have to actually rein in that corporate sort of greed, that model which just sucks the life out of economies and communities, putting it with shareholders. And even the companies themselves are saying we need to be reined in, we need to be regulated so there's a level playing field. It's clear what needs to happen now, we've just got to do it.
So we're here at Harrogate Railway Station, and no better place than to talk about the railway network and what's currently happening, because the Greens really believe that we need to bring the railways back into public hands. It's been really interesting because recently Scottish Rail has been sold to the Dutch government because the Dutch government realises there's money to be made, and that they're now using the profits from our railway system to subsidise their transport in the Netherlands. And I think it's fundamental that we bring that money back into our economy and making sure that we have a public transport network that works for people. We believe that fares have increased beyond affordability. Trains between London and Leeds cost more than trains between London and Paris, maybe even London and Brussels actually, and that this disproportionate cost means that we're not having a public railway network that works for people. We want to be making sure that we can cut fares by 10%, but also have a network that works for people, and that money is reinvested back into the railway network and doesn't disappear out into the private pockets of companies. And hopefully with more Greens elected we can fight for the renationalisation of railways.